I'll go ahead and tell you. You probably wondered, where are we going to go after Easter? We're going to go right back into the book of James. Some of you were hoping we would forget the book of James and that we wouldn't come back. But we're almost done. We're in chapter 5. We're getting close to the end. However, you can notice that the chair is up here. So that would let us all know that today is one of those sit-down talks. Today is just one of those days that I want us to sit and have a conversation. Because of all the messages that we've preached in the book of James, today potentially has the potential to be the heaviest one yet. You know, maybe you're here this morning and you find yourself currently, right now in this moment, maybe in the toughest season of your life. Maybe some of you would go as far as to say you're at rock bottom. Maybe there's been thoughts that have gone through your mind that I'm just ready to throw in the towel and I'm ready to be done. And if that's where you're at today, if that has gone through your mind, if that's gone through your heart, my prayer has been that you would today recognize that the timing of God's message today that he has for us today would be one of those winks from God that says, I still hear you and I love you. I still see you. Because a lot of us, when you're in these tough seasons, it may feel as if God doesn't hear us, if God doesn't see us. But I hope today's message would be that moment where you can say, well, maybe he does hear me. And I pray that God meets you right in the middle of your storm today. So one thing that I want to go ahead and get out there is, as we've already talked about this in the lobby this morning, but y'all do realize that this life that we live here on this earth is full of seasons of tough times. It's full of valleys, it's full of difficulties, it's full of heartache, it's full of hardship. I look around this room and there's so many of you that I know parts of your story. And I've sat with you in my office, I've sat with you in this room, I've prayed with you in this altar. And I've walked with you through seasons of heartache. I've sat with you, I've prayed with you, I've cried with you. Because the reality is this life that we live is full of hardships, is full of difficulties. But one thing I want us to all be reminded of today is these tough times, they come not because God's mad at you, not because God's frustrated with you, but we experience heartache and difficult seasons in this life because we live in a fallen, broken, sinful world. It's not because God's angry with you. And so, as a result of this broken, sinful, fallen world, as I've said before, you do realize like you're one phone call away or one text message away from entering in a tough season. Your phone could go off in the midst of this service and your world completely be changed, be flipped on its head. And you could be entering into one of those tough seasons. And I know some of you are going, my gosh, Brian, I told y'all I needed to sit down. It's just where we're at in James chapter 5. But I want you to be reminded of where we started in the book of James. In James chapter 1, verse 2, he gives us fair warning. James does. He says in verse 2, it'll be on the screen, consider it great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials. Our Savior even speaks to it in John 16:33. Jesus says, I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. You will have suffering in this world. Be courageous. I've conquered the world. I've conquered the world. So today, as we unpack what we're going to look at in verses 7 through 11 in James chapter 5, I want you to understand that today is not the secret recipe of how to avoid hardship. Today is not the magic formula, if you would, to avoid tough seasons in life. But what you're going to hear today is how, as a follower of Christ, we are called to respond to them. When they come, how should a follower of Christ respond? And so I want you to read with me in these 5 verses of James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11. James says, therefore, brothers and sisters, so keep in mind, here we are again, writing specifically to the believers. Be patient until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth and is patient with it until it receives the early and the late rains. Verse 8, you also must be patient. Strengthen your hearts because the Lord's coming is near. Brothers and sisters, do not complain about one another so that you will not be judged. Look, the judge stands at the door. Brothers and sisters, take the prophets who spoke in the Lord's name as an example of suffering and patience. See that we count as blessed those who have endured. And you have heard of Job's endurance and have seen the outcome that the Lord brought about. The Lord is compassionate and merciful. Just to sort of get us all on kind of a level playing field, we all know what it feels like to anticipate something. We all know what it feels like to be anxious, to be impatient. I know for me, I'm a very, very impatient individual. So when we know that we're gonna wrestle with being impatient, we know that we're gonna wrestle with anticipation, we're gonna wrestle with being anxious about certain things, there's also, we have to realize there's people in our lives that want to fix everything. Y'all have people in your life that just want to fix everything for you. So when they see us being impatient, when they see us being anxious, there's one thing that absolutely drives me nuts when I hear from that person that wants to fix it all. Just be patient. Just be patient. You know what I really want to do in that moment, right? Karate chop them right in the throat. Because I don't want to hear be patient when I'm anxious, when I'm worried, when I'm anticipating something. That's the last thing I want to hear is be patient. So think about when you tell your children, you've seen your kids act that way. You tell them to be patient. And then what do? They cross their arms, they pout. You realize we respond the very same way a child does when we hear the very same thing. But as a parent, I know for me, and maybe I'm just speaking on my behalf, when I'm telling my kids to be patient, I'm essentially just telling them, leave me alone. That's what that's communicating in a very nicest, most polite way. Is just say, hey, just get away from me. Just be patient. But I respond the very same way my kids do when I hear this. So maybe you're here this morning, and what I want you to understand is that oftentimes when we hear someone tell us be patient, it's a pacifier. It's just to get us quiet. It's just to get us to move on to the next thing. But what I want you to understand is that what James is telling the child of God today is much bigger than just trying to pacify us, to try to get us to be quiet. That's not what James's intention is here for the believer. But I know if you're like me, when I hear of difficult seasons in this life, and James is telling me, he's telling the child of God, hey, I know times are tough, but just be patient. In my mind, I'm going, James, really? That's all you got? Dude, I thought you would give more than just be patient. But what I don't want you to miss is he does. We all know we need to be patient, but the big question that all of us probably have this morning is, I know I'm supposed to be patient, but how do I obtain it? How do I obtain being patient? What I don't want you to miss is James has already answered that in verse 7. of how we as children of God can find patience and we can find endurance. And what he begins to teach them, what he begins to show them is to not be overwhelmed by their circumstances, but be overwhelmed by the promises of God. Things would look a lot different if we weren't overwhelmed by our circumstances, but instead we became overwhelmed with the promises of God. And the promise that God has shared with us in verse 7 is the greatest news for the child of God. The promise that we have just read is this: the Lord is coming. I don't think y'all heard me. The Lord is coming. This is our hope. This is how we obtain patience. This is how we obtain endurance to keep moving forward. And so what James does already in verse 7 is he shifts their way of thinking from what's going on, and he turns their attention to what's coming. He steers their attention from what's going on, and he attempts to steer it towards what is coming. And this is where it's so important to remember what we've been studying in the book of James. In James chapter 4, if you remember, we talked about that this life is what? A vapor. It's short. We're not here very long. And what you also need to be reminded of is, as we've already talked this morning, this world, it's not home. This world is not our home. We read about that in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 14. For we do not have an enduring city here. Instead, we seek the one to come. We look forward to what's coming. And so as we think about the fact that we're not created for here, we were created for an eternity with a God who loves us. That's what we were created for. That's what he created Adam and Eve for. But as a result of the sin of Adam and Eve, as a result of my sin and your sin, we have severed that eternal relationship with a God who loves us. But God, in his love and his mercy, even in spite of our sin, he saw that our sin was a result of severing that relationship, and it compelled him to send his only son to pay our price, to pay the sin debt that has to be paid. But he did it for us so that this very relationship that we destroyed, so that he can fix it. He did that. You didn't do it by good works. You didn't do it by figuring this life out. But he did it on the cross of Calvary, where he willingly laid down his life to pay for your sin and for mine. And he died on the old rugged cross. But praise be unto God, on the third day, we just celebrated it. He overcame that grave so that you and I can also experience the eternal life that was provided through the Son, Jesus Christ. And if we believe that, if you place your faith in what Christ has done for you, he's gonna fix what we've wrecked. He's gonna fix what we have wrecked. You see, the first time Jesus came, he came first to pay. But when he comes again, he's coming to get what he bought. He came the first time to pay. But when he comes again, he's gonna get what he bought. This is our hope. This is the promise. This is where we find patience. This is where we find endurance. And so on that day, when Christ comes, when Jesus comes to get what he bought, the struggles of this life, the sickness of this life, the death that we see in this world, all of that, the battle is over. There will be no more pain. There will be no more tears. There will be no more sickness. There will be no more heartache for those who are found in Christ Jesus. But I love what verse 8 said. Not only is he coming, but his coming is near. His coming is near. And the reason that I want to emphasize that his coming is near, because if you're anything like me, there's going to be days when you're in these valleys, these struggles, these heartaches, that you are ready to throw in the towel, you're ready to give up, and you feel like quitting. But I want you to keep God's word hidden in your heart to constantly remind yourself his coming's near. It won't be long. It won't be long. Then if you keep reading in what the text we've just read, James gives several examples of those who have gone on before us. He gives us models of those who have exercised patience, who have exemplified endurance. That's what I love about James. He's so practical. And in verse 7, we talk about there, he mentions first the farmer. And the reason that he talks about the farmer is because what we have to understand that in this life, yes, there's things that we have the ability, the control to respond in certain ways, but then there's also an element that we have no control of anything. And that's the example of the farmer, because what we see in the life of the farmer is that the only thing he can be responsible for is what he can control. And what I mean by that is the farmer's responsibility was to sow the seed, was to prepare the soil. But you see, that's only part of the work. Everything else, he had to trust God for. No matter how hard the farmer tries, he can't make it rain. No matter how hard the farmer tries, he can't make the seed grow. And so we see that there's elements of life that this farmer can control, but then there's also elements of life that he has no control over. I love what David Platt says. He said, we honor God with what we can control, and we trust God with what we can't. That probably needs written down if you're taking notes. We honor God with what we can control, and we trust God with what we can't. So the question that I have to ask myself, the question that I have to ask you, is what in your life has God placed in your life that you have control over? What can you control in your life? As I sit and I think about my own life, I can control how I lead my family. I can base my leadership as a husband and a father off biblical principle and biblical truth. And I can respond to that. I can raise my kids the way that I know God's word has taught me to raise my kids. I can work hard every day that my feet hit the floor. That's something I have control over. I can steward what God's entrusted me with. I can love people. These are all things that God has given me the control of. How am I going to respond to these things that I'm responsible for? But here's what I want you to understand, because I know some of you are already going, well, Pastor, I know I'm faithful with those things. I'm leading my family. I'm trying to lead my kids. I'm working hard on my job. And what I want you to understand today, that even in your faithfulness, it's not always going to go as planned. Even when you're faithful with what God has called you to do, even when you are faithful with what he's given you control of, it's not always going to turn out the way that you maybe envision it. maybe the way that you see it. But the question that I have to ask myself, the question that I want to ask you is, when I am being faithful with what I'm doing and it doesn't turn out the way that I think it should, am I going to keep honoring God with what I can control and trusting him with what I can't? Am I gonna stay faithful to that? Am I gonna stay true to that? Because as we read in verse 9, it was almost like a flashback from James chapter 3. He says, brothers and sisters, don't complain about one another. Y'all remember that in James chapter 3. Talking about another brother or sister in Christ. When is it appropriate? Never. It's not. He says, don't do it. And so we see that he just sort of sandwiched that into this text. And what we realize is that oftentimes when things don't go as planned, what is our knee-jerk reaction as human beings? Let's play the blame game. It's got to be somebody else's fault because I'm doing what God's called me to do. I'm being faithful. So if it's not turning out the way that I think it should, then it's got to be somebody else's fault. And James quickly says, hey, but don't start talking about and blaming it on somebody else. It's never appropriate to begin that. Because you see that that's always our response, is it's always got to be somebody else's fault when things don't go as planned. And so, not to be the bearer of bad news, but here's what I want to make you aware of. There's going to be times in life when you love people and you get nothing back. There's going to be times in life when you raise your kids the way that God's instructed you to raise them and they rebel. There's going to be times in life when you love your spouse and that marriage falls apart. There's going to be times in life at your job when you work hard, but you miss the promotion. You're faithful with what you know you can control, but it's just not turning out the way that I thought it should. And in that moment, we're often very tempted to blame all the other parties involved. But when you face those uncertainties, when you face those moments that don't turn out the way we think they should, you got to focus on what's coming. As a child of God, you got to focus on what's ahead. You got to focus on the promise that the Lord is coming. And as he talked about, we see in Scripture all the prophets that they did that. If you read in Hebrews chapter 11, you see all the faithful saints of God. A lot of people call that the heroes of the faith. And if you look at that, you can pick all of those examples and you can see people that trusted God. They trusted God with what they couldn't see, because you realize that the large majority of them never saw Jesus, but they placed their faith in the fact that he was going to come. And so when we hear about these heroes of the faith, how in the world did they stay patient? How did they find the endurance? They trusted the promises. They knew that one day a Messiah was coming. They knew that this life was temporary. And then I love how he steers the focus to an individual who probably understood this topic more than anybody that's ever walked the face of the earth. A man by the name of Job. Verse 11 says, you have heard of Job's endurance. Well, if you haven't, let me just tell you that Job was a man who had everything. He had all the wealth, he had the perfect family, he had everything. He was living what we have learned to be the American dream, whatever that is now, I don't know. Things have changed a little bit. But when we hear what Job had, we recall the conversation between Satan and God. He says, hey, you realize the only reason Job loves you is because he's got everything. And of course, I'm paraphrasing this. Because if Job didn't have all that he has, there's no way, God, he would love you the way that he does. And so with your permission, I'm gonna sift him like wheat. I'm gonna destroy everything that he has. And I just want you to wait, God. Listen to his response. And with God's permission, he tells Satan to have at it. So Satan begins the attack. Job loses all of his animals. He loses all of his wealth. He loses his family. He loses his children. His wife and his family members, his friends, they all turned their back on him. They all abandoned him. And then just to add insult to injury, he began to break out with sores all over his body. But what we notice about Job is that he was able to endure. He was able to overcome because he knew and he believed and he trusted that what he was walking through in this life was temporary. Because he knew that God had bigger plans. Sure, there were days that Job wanted to quit, just like you want to quit, just like I want to quit. There was days that Job wanted to throw in the towel. But one thing that I found in scripture that I love, it's almost as if Job had to continue to preach to himself. And some of you need to learn to preach to yourself. You need to preach yourself the truth of God's word every day when you feel like throwing in the towel, when you feel like giving up. Job chapter 19, verse 25 through 27. Verse 25, the first sentence says enough that no matter how hard times get, no matter the valley that I'm stuck in, no matter the battle that I'm walking through, verse 25, but I know that my Redeemer lives. I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the end, he will stand on the dust. Even after my skin has been destroyed, yet I will see God in my flesh. I will see him myself. My eyes will look at him, not as a stranger. And my heart longs within me. So Job is having to preach to himself. Even though my life is a train wreck right now, I know there's coming a day that I will see God for myself. I will stand before him one day for myself. And I even believe there was days that when Job was preaching this to himself, he probably didn't even believe it. But he knew that he had to do it. It was the only way he was gonna make it, is to remind that this life is temporary. And the reason I know there was days he didn't believe it, because it says so in chapter 42. That he doubted even what he was saying. Job chapter 42, verse 5 and 6. I have heard reports about you, but now my eyes have seen you. Listen to verse 6. Therefore, I reject my words, and I am sorry for them. I am dust and ashes. There were days that Job was ready to throw in the towel. There were days that Job was ready to quit. But now, according to chapter 42, there was coming a day that there was going to be proof that it was all worth it, because he was going to be standing in the presence of God, the one who created him for an eternal relationship with him. And the way that I want to close this morning is I want to close with something that's, I know, applicable for me. It's something that I've experienced, something that I've watched. And it was somebody that I watched live out what we've just talked about: having patience, finding endurance. And the lady I want to mention is a lady by the name of Miss Carolyn Carpenter. Some of you may or may not know her. If you know Carolyn Carpenter, you also know her as grandma. It didn't matter what your relationship was with her. She was grandma to everybody. This woman was a faithful woman of God. She served God. She was a faithful wife. She was a faithful mom. She was a faithful grandmother. She was an older lady who served in student ministry. Praise God, that had to be obedience. And she was a lady who weekly sang in the choir. And so when I think about Miss Carolyn Carpenter, in the midst of her faithfulness, in the midst of her taking care of what she could control, she was diagnosed with Lou Gehrig's disease. And it seemed like almost overnight, the disease very quickly began to destroy her body. Her appearance and her health deteriorated before our eyes, before everybody's eyes. But the one thing that I can say about her is we never saw that with her faith. Her faith remained constant. Her faith remained faithful. And as she battled this disease, this horrific disease, you know how many days she missed serving in student ministry? Not one. And I remember trying to carry on a conversation with her as she began to lose control of her mouth, control of her vocal cords. She couldn't even get a word out in a conversation. You know how many Sundays she missed singing in the choir? Not one. You say, well, what did she sing? She sang everything with her heart. And she stood on that stage every single week with her hands raised, with everything that was in her, and her mouth just moving. Her mouth moving with nothing coming out. She honored God with what she could control. I would go visit her at her home, and I would walk into her home, and it was the same lady I would see standing in the choir with her hands raised. Because she was honoring God with what she could control and trusting God with what she couldn't. And I remember the last time she shared her testimony, she stood on the stage with a computer and a computer-generated voice and talked about the goodness of God. That's somebody that knew that this is temporary. That for her, something was about to change. Either the Lord was coming home to get her or calling her home. One or the other, but she knew in the end she won. This is how she had the patience. This is how she found the endurance to keep moving forward. Sure, there was days she wanted to quit, I'm sure. But I think she reminded herself the same way Job did. My Redeemer lives. And there's coming a day he's going to redeem me. She honored God with what she could control and trusted him with what she couldn't. Now this morning, I shared with the team this morning, I have no idea what this response looks like. And you say, well, what's new? That's every week. Well, it is what it is. But the first layer of this response is if you're here this morning and you're apart from a relationship with God, and look, I love you enough to tell you the truth. And I know life is hard for you, even apart from God right now. And you may say, well, I'm struggling, I'm in a battle. What I want you to know today is I love you so much to tell you this struggle and this battle that you experience on this world apart from God doesn't even compare to the struggling that you will have apart from God after this life. But I want you to know that God did not create you to be apart from him. He came to fix what we've messed up. And so this morning, if you don't have a relationship with him, I want to beg you, I want to plead with you to place your faith in what Christ has done for you, that he was sent to make a way. And so I'm going to be down here in just a moment, and if today's the day that you feel that Christ is inviting you into a relationship with him, do as the word says, repent and believe. You don't have to understand it all, but just trust what God's doing and inviting you into today. But here's where it may get a little awkward. And look, I've prayed for you today. I've prayed that God would give the followers of Christ boldness today. Because we can all put on our mask in our car and walk up in here and pretend like we've got it all together, pretending like struggles are not a reality, pretending like valleys don't exist in our lives. But the fact of the matter is you've done nothing but cover it up and hide it. Because you think because you're in this building, you've got to pretend that it's all okay. Look, I'll stand before you and be the first one to tell you, everything in my life ain't okay. And what a family is supposed to be about is creating in a culture and environment where we're okay to not be okay.